Welcome to Urban American Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The metallic sound of the hydraulic hammer echoed through the Berkshire Hills Valley, Massachusetts, on a Sunday morning that would change Rutherford Langley's life forever. The 68-year-old renowned historian was returning from a conference in Boston on historic preservation when he spotted, from the top of the road that snaked between the green hills, a scene that made his heart stop. A demolition crew was methodically destroying the historic stone wall that, for more than 150 years, had silently witnessed the history of Irish immigrants in the region. "Stop! For God's sake, stop!" shouted Rutherford, his old Volvo skidding slightly on the gravel road as he braked sharply. His hands were shaking as he unbuckled his seat belt, his eyes fixed on the systematic destruction of decades of history. A few meters from the scene, Priscilla Vandermeer, wearing a designer yoga set and sunglasses that cost more than a month's rent in the area, watched the demolition with the same satisfied expression as someone watching a private show. Next to her, a man with a clipboard was taking notes while gesturing towards what remained of the wall. "Ms. Vandermeer, what's going on here?" Rutherford's voice shook with indignation as he approached, passing through the workers who had momentarily paused their activities. "Oh, Professor Langley." Priscilla removed her glasses with a studiedly dramatic movement. "How nice of you to come back from your little trip. We're just making some improvements to the property. You know, that old wall was completely ruining my view of the sunset." The historian felt his blood run cold. "Improvements? This wall is a historic landmark. It's been documented in records since 1847, built by Irish immigrants during the Great Famine. There are original inscriptions on the stones, records of entire families who—" "Darling," Priscilla interrupted him with a dismissive gesture, "when I bought this property, no one mentioned anything about historic preservation. And frankly, stones piled up by a few immigrants centuries ago can hardly be considered art. It's not like it's a Picasso, is it?" The tension in the air was palpable. The workers looked at each other, uncomfortable, while their supervisor consulted some papers, clearly looking for some authorization to justify the work. "You have no idea what you're destroying." Rutherford tried to remain calm, decades of academic experience evident in his posture. "This wall is part of a historical route. Universities bring students here. There's documentation, ongoing research. Well, now they'll have to find somewhere else for their school trips." Priscilla checked her wristwatch with studied indifference. "Besides, it's already done. The stones were sold this morning to an absolutely fabulous landscaper who works with rustic gardens. He was delighted with the authenticity of the material." The horror of the situation hit Rutherford like a punch in the gut. Not only was the wall being destroyed, its stones, each an irreplaceable historical record, were being dispersed as mere decorations. In the days that followed, Rutherford tried every legal avenue possible. He contacted the local Historic Preservation Board, archaeologists from the University of Massachusetts, even a lawyer specializing in cultural heritage. But Priscilla Vandermeer proved to be a formidable opponent. For every attempt to document the destruction, she responded with an accusation of harassment. For every expert Rutherford brought onto the property, she filed a restraining order. The new resident had quickly established herself as a dominant force in the local homeowners association, using her influence to turn the historian's life into a bureaucratic nightmare. "I don't understand how anyone can be so insensitive to history," Rutherford vented to his old college classmate, Margaret Sullivan, over coffee in her office cluttered with books and artifacts. "That wall survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, 2 World Wars. And it was destroyed in one weekend by someone who thinks history is something you buy at antique auctions." Margaret, an emeritus professor of social history, looked at her friend over her reading glasses. "The problem, Ruth, is that we're dealing with someone who sees the world through a very different lens to us." For Priscilla Vandermeer, history is something that gets in the way of her experience of life and countryside. She wants a perfectly controlled pastoral setting, not a living testimony to the past. The irony of the situation did not escape Rutherford. The same pioneering spirit that had driven Irish immigrants to build that wall was now being overlaid by a new wave of pioneers, wealthy New Yorkers fleeing the city in search of a romanticized version of rural life. even if it meant destroying the very historical markers that gave the region its unique character. As he gazed out of his office window at the hills where the century-old wall used to wind its way, Rutherford began to formulate a plan. If he couldn't save the wall, he would at least document its history and the story of its destruction for future generations. Maybe then, he thought, other landmarks could be saved from a similar fate. What he didn't know was that his battle with Priscilla Vandermeer was just beginning, and that the fate of the stone wall would be only the first chapter in a saga that would involve the entire community in a debate about the value of history versus the price of progress. News of the destruction of the historic wall spread quickly through the small Berkshire Hills community. At the local coffee shop, the Rustic Bean, groups of residents discussed the incident in indignant tones, while others showed concern about the growing power that the new residents wielded over the homeowners association. "You're not going to believe this," said Martha Jenkins, a local librarian, placing a crumpled newspaper on Rutherford's desk. "Priscilla Vandermeer has just been elected president of the HOA, and her first order of business is to modernize the neighborhood's historic building code." Rutherford looked at the local headline with a mixture of incredulity and resignation. The photo showed Priscilla at her performative best, posing alongside other members of the newly elected board, all recent arrivals from large urban centers. "She's turning our historic neighborhood into a playground for bored millionaires," Rutherford muttered, running his fingers over his cold cup of coffee. "And the worst part is that she's getting support." Priscilla's campaign for HOA president had been meticulously planned. Promises of revitalization and modernization attracted the votes of the new residents, who, like her, dreamed of an idealized version of country life without the inconveniences of real history. Determined not to let the destruction of the wall go unnoticed, Rutherford began a thorough search. In his private library, surrounded by bookshelves that reached to the ceiling, he spent days immersed in old documents, letters and photographic records that documented the historical importance of the structure. "Professor Langley?" A young voice interrupted him in the middle of his research. It was Connor O'Brien, one of his most dedicated former students, now an assistant professor at the local university. "I brought something you need to see." Connor carefully unfolded a set of yellow documents. "I found these in the university archives. They're the original letters from the Irish families who built the wall. There are detailed descriptions of the construction process, the inscriptions, and something more interesting." Rutherford's eyes scanned the pages with growing interest. The letters revealed that the wall wasn't just a division of property, it was a memorial. Each stone had been carefully selected and engraved with names, dates, and messages from the families who had survived the Great Famine in Ireland. "That changes everything," said Rutherford, his voice trembling slightly. It wasn't just a historical wall. It was a monument to the survivors, a living record of their journey. Meanwhile, Priscilla Vandermeer began to implement her changes in the community. New regulations emerged, all seemingly aimed at preserving the character of the neighborhood, but in practice, forcing older homeowners to make expensive modifications to their properties. The tension reached its peak when Rutherford discovered that the landscaper who had bought the stones from the wall was using them to build an ornamental fountain at Priscilla's new mansion. The same stones that carried the history of generations were being turned into garden decoration. "This is cultural desecration," declared Dr. Eleanor Martinez, an archaeologist at the university, after examining photographs of the relocated stones. "Those inscriptions are of inestimable historical value. Using these stones as building material is like burning a historical document for warmth." The news attracted the attention of the local press. The Boston Globe published a story on the conflict, highlighting the growing phenomenon of rural gentrification and its impact on historical heritage. Priscilla, however, turned the negative publicity into a marketing opportunity. "We are preserving these historical relics in a way that everyone can appreciate," she said in a press release. "Instead of an old, decaying wall, we'll have a beautiful fountain that celebrates our cultural heritage." The statement provoked a wave of indignation in the academic community. Professors, historians, and preservationists began to speak out publicly against what they called the sanitized destruction of historical heritage. Rutherford, however, had a trick up his sleeve. During his research, he discovered that the wall had been officially registered as a historic landmark in 1972, a detail he had apparently missed during the sale of the property. The registration was never revoked, explained Richard Lawson, his lawyer, while examining the documents. Technically, the demolition was illegal. More importantly, the stones are still considered historical heritage, regardless of where they are now. This discovery opened a new chapter in the battle. It was no longer just about a wall, it was about a community's right to preserve its history against the forces of rampant gentrification. The HOA, under Priscilla's leadership, reacted with a series of fines and notices against the Rutherford property, alleging code violations that had never been issues before. Each registered letter that arrived in her mailbox was yet another reminder of the power her adversary had amassed. But Rutherford was not alone. Gradually, other residents began to speak out, sharing their own stories of intimidation and pressure from the new HOA administration. What began as a dispute over a historic wall was turning into a community resistance movement. On a particularly cold autumn evening, while organizing his paperwork for a preliminary hearing, Rutherford found something that would completely change the course of the battle. It was an old black and white photograph showing the wall in its original glory, and on it, clearly visible, was an inscription that would prove to be the key to much more than just the preservation of a few old stones. An unexpected discovery completely changed the course of the battle between Rutherford and Priscilla. The black and white photograph found in the archives didn't just show the historic wall in its original state, it revealed a surprising connection to the Vandermeer family itself. On the image dated 1849, a clear inscription read, "In memory of Patrick Vandermeer, who took us in times of need." Subsequent research revealed that an ancestor of Priscilla's had been instrumental in the settlement of Irish immigrants in the region, offering work and shelter during the early years of colonization. "It's ironic, isn't it?" commented Connor O'Brien, helping Rutherford organize the documentation. Her ancestor helped build this community, and now she's trying to erase that same history. The discovery caused a stir in the community. The local newspaper, the Berkshire Chronicle, published an extensive report on the historical connection, including testimonies from historians and genealogists who confirmed the link between the original Vandermeers and the Irish immigrants. Priscilla, confronted with this revelation during a tense HOA meeting, tried to downplay its importance. "Any connection between my family and some 19th century workers is purely circumstantial," she declared, nervously adjusting her pearl necklace. "Besides, traditions need to evolve. We can't stay stuck in the past." But the tide was beginning to turn. Other residents, inspired by Rutherford's research, began to investigate their own connections to local history. Martha Jenkins, the librarian, organized an impromptu exhibition at the municipal library, displaying photographs and documents that showed the rich tapestry of stories that connected the old and new families in the area. "What Priscilla doesn't understand," Rutherford explained during an interview for a local podcast on historic preservation, "is that we're not just fighting for old stones. We're fighting for the soul of this community." The legal battle has also gained momentum. Richard Lawson, Rutherford's attorney, discovered that the wall's historic registration was tied to a series of state grants for cultural preservation. The demolition not only violated local regulations, but also jeopardized future funding for preservation projects in the region. "They will have to answer not only for the destruction of the wall," explained Lawson, "but also for the impact on the county's entire historic preservation program." The pressure has begun to affect Priscilla's social circle. Some of the new residents who initially supported her began to question her decisions. In a surprising move, 3 HOA board members resigned their positions, citing irreconcilable differences with the leadership. Meanwhile, the community mobilized in unexpected ways. A group of architecture students from the local university began a digital documentation project, creating a 3D model of the wall based on old photographs and historical accounts. Local artists organized an exhibition called Stones of Memory, using fragments recovered from the wall in installations that told the story of local immigration. Priscilla's response was to increase the pressure. New fines were issued against historic properties, citing increasingly obscure violations of the HOA code. But each action only strengthened the community's resistance. "She's digging her own political grave," observed Margaret Sullivan during one of the regular meetings of the newly formed Berkshire Hills Historic Preservation Committee. The more she tries to exert control, the more people turn against her policies. The turning point came when Connor discovered records of an old annual ceremony that used to take place at the wall. Every March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, local families would gather for a celebration that honored both the Irish immigrants and the residents who had welcomed them, including the original Wanderers. The discovery inspired an idea. The community decided to revive the celebration, even without the physical wall. On a Saturday morning, more than 200 residents gathered where the wall used to be, each carrying a stone on which they had written their own family stories. "Today we are not just remembering the past," said Rutherford in his speech to the crowd. "We are building bridges between generations, between old and new, between all the stories that make this community what it is." From the balcony of her mansion, Priscilla watched the scene with an expression that was impossible to decipher. The ornamental fountain in her garden, built with the historic stones, seemed strangely out of place in contrast to the authenticity of the moment unfolding beyond her high walls. The battle over the stone wall had turned into something bigger than a dispute over ownership or historic preservation. It had become a catalyst for a movement that was redefining the meaning of community in an era of rapid change and conflicting values. As the sun set over the Berkshire Hills, the same view that Priscilla had tried to improve with the demolition of the wall, a new history was being written. A history no longer engraved in stone, but in the hearts and actions of a community united in defense of their shared heritage. What no one knew was that the next chapter in this saga would bring even more surprising revelations, which would force both Rutherford and Priscilla to question everything they thought they knew about the past that connected them. The black and white photograph that revealed the connection between the Vandermeers and the Irish immigrants was just the beginning of a web of revelations that would shake the foundations of the Berkshire Hills. During a rainy afternoon at the town library, Connor O'Brien discovered something even more significant in the newly digitized files. "Professor Langley, you need to see this right away," said Connor, his voice quivering with excitement as he held up a set of yellow documents. "I found Patrick Vandermeer's original will, dated 1865, and there's a specific clause about the wall." Rutherford adjusted his reading glasses as he examined the document. His hands trembled slightly as he read the words written in ancient calligraphy. "The stone wall, built in partnership with our Irish brothers, is to stand as a perpetual testament to our union in times of adversity. Its preservation will be an obligation binding on this land and all who come here after me." "That changes everything," whispered Martha Jenkins, who had quietly approached. "It's a legally binding historical servitude." Priscilla didn't just violate modern regulations, she broke a centuries-old agreement that was part of the deed to the property itself. Richard Lawson, hastily summoned to an emergency meeting, could barely contain his professional enthusiasm. "This is pure legal gold," he declared, spreading out documents on the oak table in his office. "Historical easements are practically inviolable when properly registered, and this document is registered in triplicate." News of the discovery spread quickly through the community, but before Rutherford could formally present the documents, Priscilla organized a special meeting of the HOA. The topic: a proposal to completely modernize the neighborhood's historic code, effectively eliminating all existing protections for old structures. "It's a desperate attempt to cover her tracks," observed Margaret Sullivan, as a group of residents gathered in the old Episcopal church to discuss strategies. "She wants to change the rules before we can use them against her." Tension in the community reached its peak when a group of historians and archaeologists from the University of Massachusetts arrived to examine the fragments of the wall that could still be found in Priscilla's garden. She responded by calling the police and accusing them of trespassing. "It's ironic," commented Dr. Eleanor Martinez, as she was escorted off the property. "She's so determined to protect her privacy that she doesn't realize she's destroying the very history that gave this land its value in the first place." The situation took an unexpected turn when Gerard Vandermeer, a distant cousin of Priscilla's and a history professor at Princeton, contacted Rutherford after reading about the controversy. "Our family has always been proud of her role in building this community," he wrote in an email. What Priscilla is doing not only dishonors the memory of Patrick Vandermeer, but contradicts everything our family has stood for generations. With Gerard's support, Rutherford and his team gained access to a private family archive that revealed even more about the history of the wall. The stones weren't just dividing marks, they were part of an elaborate communication system used during the Underground Railroad, helping runaway slaves find safe haven on their way to freedom. Every mark, every symbol that Priscilla so casually destroyed had a deep meaning, Connor explained during a public presentation at the library. The wall wasn't just a physical structure, it was a map of hope, a testament to humanity in times of crisis. The revelation about the wall's role in the Underground Railroad attracted national media attention. Journalists began arriving in the Berkshire Hills, television cameras appeared at HOA meetings, and suddenly Priscilla found herself under scrutiny that her money and influence could not control. In an attempt to control the narrative, she organized a press conference in her garden, next to the controversial fountain built with the historic stones. "I'm being unfairly portrayed as a villain," she declared, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "All I've done is try to improve our community, bring progress and modernity to a place stagnating in the past." But as she spoke, something extraordinary happened. A strong summer storm, common in the region, descended on the Berkshire Hills. The heavy rain began to wash away the stones of the fountain, revealing inscriptions that had been covered in a thin layer of paint-coated messages from the Underground Railroad, preserved for over 150 years, now exposed for all to see. It was a moment of literal and metaphorical revelation that no one who was present would ever forget. The television cameras captured it all, the inscriptions emerging from the rain, the look of shock on Priscilla's face, and the gradual transformation in those present's understanding of the true meaning of what had been lost and what could still be saved. The battle for the Berkshire Hills stone wall had become something much bigger than a dispute between neighbors or a question of historic preservation. It had become a symbol of the constant struggle between progress and preservation, between change and continuity, between the right to transform and the duty to preserve. And as the rain continued to fall, washing away layers of paint and revealing long-hidden truths, a new story began to be written, a story that would prove that sometimes true progress lies in knowing how to honor and protect the testimonies of the past that brought us here. The dawn in the Berkshire Hills brought with it a different atmosphere. The revelations about the wall's role in the Underground Railroad had turned a local dispute into a case of national significance. Historic preservation teams, historians, and activists converged on the small town, all eager to document and preserve what remained of this important landmark. Priscilla Vandermeer, for the first time since her arrival in the town, found herself in a defensive position. The discovery of the coded inscriptions on her ornamental fountain had gone viral on social media, and public pressure was relentless. Her Manhattan law firm strongly recommended a change of strategy. "Ms. Vandermeer," said her lead attorney during a private video conference, "we need to consider a settlement. The damage to your reputation could be irreparable if we continue down this path." Meanwhile, Rutherford worked tirelessly with a team of historical restoration experts. Each stone recovered from the source was carefully documented, photographed, and studied. The coded messages revealed a complex network of routes and signs that had guided hundreds of people in search of freedom. "It's extraordinary," commented Dr. Eleanor Martinez, examining one of the stones under ultraviolet light. "Each apparently decorative mark tells a story. Here, this spiral pattern indicated the presence of a safe haven 3 miles to the north." The community mobilized in surprising ways. Local families began scouring their own records and properties, looking for connections to the Underground Railroad. What emerged was a much richer and more complex picture of local history than anyone had imagined. Gerard Vandermeer, Priscilla's cousin, became a constant presence in the town. His knowledge of family history and his public support for preservation created a visible fissure in the apparent unity of the Vandermeer family. Patrick Vandermeer wasn't just a benefactor of Irish immigrants, Gerard explained during a talk at the municipal library. He was part of a larger network of abolitionists who used their wealth and influence to protect those seeking freedom. The wall was his most visible legacy, but only one part of a much bigger story. The pressure finally had an effect. One fall morning, Priscilla requested a private meeting with Rutherford on neutral ground, the rustic bean. She arrived without her usual entourage of lawyers, dressed more discreetly than usual. "Professor Langley," she began, her voice betraying a vulnerability rarely seen. "I've spent the last few weeks reading about Patrick Vandermeer, about what he built here, not just in stone, but in trust and community. I made a terrible mistake." Priscilla's confession paved the way for more constructive negotiations. An agreement was drawn up. She would finance the reconstruction of the wall, using the original stones wherever possible, and establish a foundation for historic preservation in Patrick Vandermeer's name. "I can't undo what has been done," she admitted during an HOA meeting where she resigned as president, "but I can help preserve what remains and ensure that this history is never forgotten." Rebuilding the wall has become a community project. Under the supervision of historic restoration experts, volunteers worked on weekends, carefully repositioning each recovered stone. Where the original stones couldn't be found, new ones were added, each engraved with contemporary stories from the community. Connor O'Brien coordinated an oral history project, collecting accounts from local families about their connections to the wall and the Underground Railroad. "We're creating layers of history," he explained. "The wall now tells not only the story of the 19th century, but also our own story of preservation and renewal." Priscilla's transformation surprised many, but perhaps no one more than herself. Gradually, she began to take part in the weekend work sessions, first just observing, then helping to catalog the recovered stones. "I came to the Berkshire Hills looking for a more meaningful life," she confessed during a break from work. "Ironically, I found exactly that, only in a way I never imagined." The following spring, the rebuilt wall was officially reopened. The ceremony brought together descendants of the original Irish families, Underground Railroad historians, and members of the community. A commemorative plaque was installed, recognizing both the wall's original history and its recent journey of destruction and rebirth. Rutherford, observing the gathered crowd, reflected on how a battle for historic preservation had turned into a lesson about community and redemption. "This wall has always been more than stacked stones," he said in his inauguration speech. "It was and remains a testament to how different people can come together in difficult times. Its destruction almost divided us, but its rebuilding brought us together in ways that none of us could have foreseen." The Patrick Vandermeer Foundation for Historic Preservation, established by Priscilla, has become a model for other communities facing similar challenges. The rebuilt wall, now protected by much stricter regulations, has once again become part of the local tourist itinerary, but with an even richer story to tell. And on Sunday mornings, it was not uncommon to see Priscilla Vandermeer sitting on a bench next to the wall, watching the sun rise through the stones that now told not only the story of her ancestors, but also her own story of transformation and rebirth. The Berkshire Hill stone wall stands as a reminder that true historic preservation is not just about protecting physical structures, but about keeping alive the stories that connect us across generations, and that sometimes you have to lose something precious to truly understand its value.